Welcome to the Analog Gamers Podcast, a short podcast on board games and board gaming experiences. Here are your hosts.
I'm Shane.
And I'm Brent.
And I'm Frank.
Hi, folks. Welcome to our podcast. We are kind of in mourning here because we recorded an episode on worker placement, and due to a complete screw-up, Frank blew it away, and we are now trying to come up with this. We're not going to try and recreate the podcast. That would not be possible. But we are going to hit some highlights. This will probably be a little bit shorter than usual, partially because we're kind of a little emotionally spent from this, and partially because we think we can probably do this more quickly. So, the topic was worker placement. We've brought that up before. We have talked about it several times, and kind of building up to this, and this will be the end of the season, and we will finish out all the thoughts we had on some of these other games with finishing worker placement. So, gentlemen, let's talk about some of the conclusions we came to on talking about this.
Yeah, so defining worker placement, we kind of wrestled through a bunch of different games and trying to come up with a definitive kind of definition that we could all agree upon, as usual. So in worker placement, you have traditionally meeples, cards, or dice that you're placing out on the board to claim actions that are generally exclusive once you've placed your workers there. So you can block other players from taking those actions. So you're placing your workers out on the board to be able to claim actions. So once you place your worker, you perform that action, whether it's gathering a resource or a different action that you're taking. Some of the games that are most familiar to us, and one of our favorites is Lords of Waterdeep. So in Lords of Waterdeep, you're placing your workers out within the city of Waterdeep to gather adventurers, whether they be warriors, rogues, wizards, whatever they are, and then those adventurers will go on quests to complete for you to gain victory points.
Another one we talked about that we thought had a really interesting twist was Alien Frontiers. And I know we've talked about it before in the season, but in that game you have a set number of dice that you roll on your turn, and the results of those dice rolls allow you to place those in different different actions throughout the game, either allowing you to build new ships or place workers on the colony. We thought that was a real interesting twist on the worker placement because it also involved dice rolling, and it limited you to what actions you could select. You didn't have an open field of actions. You instead had to choose from what you rolled and what other people have already covered up on their turns. Another place we thought that was really interesting was you place all of your workers on your turn rather than doing that in turn order, like is more traditional in a worker placement.
Yeah, rather than one worker at a time.
Right.
You place all of them.
So you collect everything. The turns run very smoothly because you're not moving back and forth and having to change your strategy for that whole turn. Once you get there, you can define your strategy based on the dice you roll.
Yeah, and another difference being in Lords of Waterdeep, everybody places one at a time, and then at the end, once everybody's placed all of theirs, you take all the workers off and you start over. Whereas in Alien Frontiers, on your turn, you only take your workers off, and everybody else's are still present on the board, blocking what you potentially might want to do. So rather than really being round-based, it's more turn-based because all the workers aren't coming off at the end of every single round.
So this led us to that conclusion that really worker placements is not usually a solid mechanic on itself. It's usually always tied with some other mechanic, and it's kind of the interesting twists and turns that takes that make these a lot of fun.
Right. It's typically in these games, all the meeples do come off at the end of a round. They don't come off on your turn.
Right.
Additionally, I think one of the things we came to the conclusion of was that because of the way worker placement happens, typically you are, in placing the worker, you are selecting the action. We talked about some games where you select an action that places a worker, or places a meeple, which is a slightly different, and that may be one of the distinguishing differences between. But because it is just a matter of how you select the action, that can't be the end of the game. It can't really be an exclusive mechanic like auctioning or some of those things. Worker placement tends to be one mechanic amongst several that are used in a game. We also talked about the fact that because you have actions to select from, and those actions are by and large the same from turn to turn. There may be one or two that switch out or progress, but by and large the actions are the same. You have a pretty defined decision space, which has many options, but not an overwhelming number.
Yeah, and the complexity of games with this mechanic isn't in how many choices you have, but rather in making the right choices within the defined set that you have. And, you know, there's not all-out aggression in the game, so you can't just knock another player off the board and then they're out of the game or they have to recover. But there's kind of a passive aggressiveness to worker placement where if I know everybody really is looking to gather warriors in Lords of Waterdeep, and I, you know, could use a warrior, but may not necessarily need one at this moment, I can still take up the space that's going to give warriors or recruit warriors so that everybody else around the table can't. And so it really also lends itself to that extra layer of thinking of not just what's best for me this turn, but kind of net what's best for me and also is blocking other people. So what's the net benefit for me is really kind of where the complexity is introduced within games that use the worker placement mechanic.
We had a conversation also about Mission Red Planet because we had brought it up before and said it was a worker placement. And we kind of came to the conclusion that it's probably not. It does have that you are placing your meeples to do something, but because the actual selection is based upon your cards and your hand management, that's probably not an actual worker placement. To clarify that for people who have listened to previous episodes.
One of the big strengths of all of these games that we've talked about this entire season, and one of the reasons we've had so many discussions of, well, is this the worker placement mechanic, is this a different mechanic, is that we all think that the best games fuse mechanics and mix mechanics and allude to mechanics so that, right, a game isn't just one mechanic. It isn't just you come to the table and do one thing over and over and over again, but rather, you know, this one mechanic triggers another mechanic, which triggers another. Or in Alien Frontiers, right, the mechanic of dice rolling and worker placement are the same. They can't be separated. So really the strength of a lot of the games that we love is kind of the mixing and fusion of all of these different mechanics that we've talked about throughout the season, including that worker placement games, we think really do this well because worker placement is a mechanic that lends itself to stacking mechanics or fusing different mechanics together. So if we had to suggest a worker placement game to a casual player, casual listeners, what's the game with a worker placement mechanic that you would suggest, Brent?
So I think the game I would suggest would be Lords of Waterdeep. I think it's an easy enough game that the basics people can get down, they can play it, and they can probably enjoy it if they're going to enjoy worker placements at all. It gives you, I think, out of the ones we've discussed, the most actual worker placement without twists or turns or anything else for people to work with.
Yeah, for somebody that's, again, just getting into gaming super casual, I think that would definitely be my suggestion too. If somebody's kind of already in the hobby and really getting into it, I think Alien Frontiers is a really good kind of next step game with the worker placement mechanic. How about you, Frank?
So I would have gone with Lords of Waterdeep. That was the one that came to mind immediately.
So it sounds like everybody needs to play Lords of Waterdeep.
Yeah, so I think that's a real strong candidate. But in the interest of variety, I will offer up, I think I would go with Alien Frontiers. It's not too complicated. It might be hard to find because I don't know. Well, no, they just recently, in the past few months, came out with another edition.
Or message us and we can have friends come play.
Absolutely. And we've got other ones that we will get to the table. So, if you've got questions, always you should feel free to email us.
Or suggestions on a good worker placement that you've played that we should play.
Great. We are always looking to expand what we're looking to play. So, we thank you for joining us this season. I don't want you to walk away thinking that we have now given you a definitive list of mechanics in games. The mechanisms that are in games are wide and varied. We hit several of the major ones, but there are variations upon variations, as you can probably tell in the fact that we have trouble categorizing these games. The thing is to kind of get the language of game playing. So when someone walks up to you and says, hey, I have a great worker placement game that's about settling the new world, you kind of have an idea of, okay, the theme's cool, it's historical, or maybe not. I like worker placement, or maybe not. But the point is, now that you have these kinds of things under your belt, you can actually start to get an idea without having to play them. Is this a game I'm interested in or not? Don't limit yourself too much. That would be a great way to choose which game you want to play today. But there are games that I say, I don't normally like these mechanisms. And then I'm surprised by how much I do like an individual game. So I'm not using that to say be exclusive. I am using that to say be discerning. We will see you back in May. We have not quite yet determined what our topics will be for that season. As you may have seen on the podcast page, we would appreciate your input on what we should entertain. And we will see you in a few weeks.
See you next season.
Thanks.
This has been the Analog Gamers Podcast. Thanks for listening. Please spread the word about our podcast, which can be found at theanaloggamers.libsyn.com. You can email us at theanaloggamers@gmail.com or find us on Facebook as The Analog Gamers. Our intro and outro are recorded by Daniel Feldman. Logo artwork provided by Tabitha Jordan Nichols. The Analog Gamers Podcast is licensed under Attribution, No Commercial, Non-Derivative, Creative Commons 4.0 license.